Hi. So, thank you so much for your help. I really appreciate. And even though you just mentioned about this story about the Shimoda case, about your student brought to your, but I was not, the audience didn't know that yet.
Yes.
So I want to ask you again,
Okay.
if you don't mind. いいですか?
Yeah,
Okay. So, first question is, how did you encounter the Shimoda case?
Well, it came to me by way of a young Japanese diplomat who was studying at Princeton University, where I was teaching at the time, and he gave a oral presentation of his paper in which he described the Shimoda case, which struck me as a extremely significant legal development because it was the first time that a judicial institution had passed legal judgment on the use of the atomic bombs, and it was clear from his presentation that it was a diligent and important jurisprudential analysis that deserved to be understood and widely disseminated in the West, and among, particularly among those countries that were continuing to rely and develop nuclear weaponry.
So,
and then I wrote this article that derived from that oral presentation in order to stimulate more interest and discussion.
So it was oral presentation. Oral,
Yes, oral presentation, but I think he, if my memory is accurate, I think he also submitted a written version as part of the requirements in the course.
So before that, you didn't know about that? There is no news?
No, it came out of a complete unknown reality.
Yeah.
And as far as I know, no one knew. No one in the West knew.
So what was your initial impression or response? You were shocked, or what was your first thought about it?
Well, I thought it seemed to validate the view that I held independently, that this was a terrible precedent from a moral point of view, and politically it was something that added to the fragility of international order, and legally, on the basis of general principles of law, was clearly violating what had been understood to be constraints on the use of force in the course of a war. And the military necessity argument seemed very weak to me in view of the increasing awareness by that time that the real motivation for using atomic bombs was not to end the war more rapidly, but to send a threatening message to the Soviet Union.
What do you mean? Can you elaborate? To the Soviet Union. So you're talking about the main real purpose was not to make Japan surrender, but to send a message to Soviet Union that we are the best. Is that the point?
Not merely the best, but that Soviet policy should recognize that we, the U.S., has this super weapon, and if the Soviet Union encroaches upon Western interests, particularly in Europe, it can possibly face this kind of future itself. And it was, and what it did, and this is relevant, I think, to the current situation with Iran, instead of avoiding nuclear weaponry, it encouraged the Soviet Union to put into operation an emergency program to acquire nuclear weapons for itself. So it really stimulated the initial proliferation of this weaponry and created it abandoned the early interest in nuclear disarmament and replaced it with a nuclear arms race among the leading countries. And the 5 winners of World War II were the first 5 to acquire nuclear weaponry. And it is still, I think, a major threat to the future of humanity and to the survival of civilization. Daniel Ellsberg, who was close friend and died a year or so, maybe it's 2 years now, 2 years ago, I had conversations with him shortly before his death, in which he indicated very clearly that he believed there would be a nuclear war, and that combined with a so-called nuclear winter, and that the result would be not total human extinction, but maybe 10% of humanity would survive. And I remember him saying, well, that's a lot of people, that's 800 million people, and did I agree with that assessment that he was making? But, he wrote the Doomsday Machine book and was an insider in the sense of access to the nuclear war plans, which definitely frightened him into becoming a nuclear opponent, anti-nuclear person.
Okay, that's pretty interesting. Let's go back to the Shimoda case. So that kind of thought, way of thinking, you already had before you...
Yes.
Okay. So you had the idea about the doubt of American story, American narrative, to justify usage of the first or second atomic bomb against Japan.
Yes.
Right? So it was not real to shorten the World War II or saved their lives, but more is kind of propaganda to show, demonstrate for the...
Yes. My interest was, I didn't feel qualified as a historian to examine that argument, though I accepted the argument of others about the motivations for using the bomb. My primary interest was to avoid a future use and to find political support for nuclear disarmament and denuclearization rather than what was happening at the time was a nuclear arms race, which was expensive, dangerous, and highly immoral. And I had written on the nuclear issues prior to this Shimoda case. My interest was such that I had written with some Princeton colleagues on adopting a no first use policy, and I think on the role of the UN in stopping the nuclear arms race.
So you are already that kind of person who had so many wonder or question about the nuclear weapon or atomic bombs, right?
Yes.
Then, when you heard about this Shimoda case by your student, the Japanese diplomat, right? What was your initial thought about the fact that such a trial had took place in Japan?
Yes, I was very intrigued by that realization, and especially the kind of ironic sensitivity of issuing the opinion on the anniversary of Pearl Harbor attack, so that it was a way of expressing a certain acceptance of Japanese guilt for the war that concluded with these atomic attacks. And I was impressed by that as a sign of Japanese humility, at least in the aftermath of the war. And I also was sensitive to the controversy around the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, which of course was a victor's justice exercise that didn't examine the crimes of the winners, only the crimes of the losers. And I know that had a big impact on public opinion in Japan, and I'm told there's a statue in the major Tokyo park to the Indian judge that wrote the long dissenting opinion.
So you thought you see some of the at least brief nuance of acceptance because we did the Japan from the Shimoda case trial. Did you see some kind of acceptance of this situation from Japanese side?
I didn't know enough, but I did see that both an acceptance and a feeling that Japan should not have been singled out for this unnecessary, horrible experience associated with the attacks, and that Japan itself, through the peace constitution and other means, indicated its own withdrawal from the worst elements of the war system, and agreed to limit its military role to purely defensive of its territorial sovereignty. It was and remains, I guess, reluctant to participate in international undertakings involving the use of force or engaging in war, and it, I think, has still in place a upper limit to the annual military budget, which is an expression of its own desire for a different kind of world order in which war is minimized rather than centralized.
So you see this such a trial had took place in Japan, and you also mentioned that the Tokyo trial, right, which victory side did the losing side, right? The Tokyo trial.
Yes.
Yeah. So do you think the result or the context affected to this Shimoda case? That was the same?
You mean that it had an influence?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I think it only was influential among people who already were opposed to nuclear development. It was ignored, as far as I know, by those that were devising security policy for the major countries, not only US, but elsewhere. And there was this immediate period after World War II, after 1945, but before the Shimoda case, in which there was a popular atmosphere, a public atmosphere that would have supported nuclear disarmament. In other words, it was a position that, had the government chosen to do so, it would have been very popular with the people, the citizenry. But with the onset of the Cold War and the ideology of anti-communism and the propaganda that emphasized Soviet conventional superiority in conventional weapons, the advocates of nuclear armament and development had very little meaningful political opposition.
So it was the atmosphere during this time, right?
Yeah.
So having that atmosphere, world atmosphere or the US atmosphere, the mood you saw this similar case happened in Japan was kind of significant.
Yeah. Yes, I saw, but see, even during this period of popular enthusiasm for nuclear disarmament and a repudiation of nuclear weaponry, that was a position challenged by foreign policy elites. They never accepted that idea, and chose to think of war as an inevitable dimension of international life, and that you were more secure the stronger you were and the more that you could destroy a potential enemy. And that kind of political realism prevailed and has dominated policy ever since.
Okay, so let me go back again. So what part of the Shimada case really interests you or so shocked you? What part of Shimada case?
Oh, well, the coherence of the legal arguments and the reasoning that was brought to bear, the use of international law experts as providing the court with a knowledge base that enabled it to analyze this new issue in a convincing way, and just the sense that the only authoritative judicial tribunal that investigated this issue corresponded with the views of peace activists and international law opponents of relying on this weaponry.
And what about this trial actually took place in Japan, particularly this particular country, Japan? What did you feel about that?
You mean that Japan was both the victim and the...
No, the point is not only the US, but this kind of trial happened in Japan.
Yes. No, I think that it struck me as appropriate because Japan was not only the site of the attacks, but also the memory and the suffering that was brought about by these attacks and the survivors who suffered either injury or memories. It was entirely appropriate that Japan would feel the anguish of the attacks more deeply and over a longer period of time. So in that sense, the fact that this kind of trial or a judicial assessment occurred in Japan seemed entirely consistent with my perceptions. And I guess you're familiar with the fact that after this trial in Japan, some theater people developed a play about I don't know if it was widely shown in Japan, but I know there was a theater enactment of the whole claim, the process by which these 5 people came together to push this claim against the Japanese government. Of course, it had that kind of technical character which made it difficult for non-lawyers to appreciate. Why should Japan, the victim of this attack, be the target of these claimants. And of course, the explanation is that the Japanese government in the peace treaty had waived the rights of Japanese citizens to proceed against the U.S. And part of the Shimoda case is to validate that view and say that although the attacks were clearly in violation of international law, the Japanese government is not responsible because it was entitled to enter this diplomatic resolution of the conflict.
Okay. By the way, why did you decide to write about the Shimoda case in the article?
Oh, because I felt that it was so important as a way, first, of memorializing the victimization of Japan in these attacks, and secondly, by advancing a coherent argument that challenged the prevailing views on post-World War II security by this sort of fundamental critique of relying on this weaponry of mass destruction.
So this is in the context of how the world should see the nuclear weapons. This Shimoda case, it was really significant. It's a really important step.
Yes, very important step. It was to some extent complemented or reinforced by the advisory opinion that the International Court of Justice handed down in, I think, 1996, and basically reinforced the Shimoda case, but more in the context of the Non-Proliferation Treaty than by reference to the atomic attacks in World War II.
So that means, sorry, the international law about nuclear weapon is somehow, this was the first base to study.
Yes. First, I mean, you did have certain things that were done at the UN, for instance, the General Assembly Resolution 1653 was an attempt to, by the governments representing the majority of peoples of the world, to criminalize the threat or use of this kind of weapon.
But like I said, like you said, it was actually done in Japan, where it was bombed, and
Yes.
also by the victim. So
Yes.
not only the idea of thought, but real physical memory, the real things happen there. That's why it's really...
Yes, that's why it's moving and touching as well as intellectually and politically important. It had a kind of human dimension that, because of the Japanese experience and accentuated by the critique of why the atomic bombs were used against cities, and there was a sub-critique, an additional critique that said bombing Hiroshima should have been enough to show the Soviet Union the potency of the weaponry. Why Nagasaki? Why the second bomb? You know, there's that kind of issue as well.
Okay. And also, they say the dropping of the atomic bomb was clearly a violation of international law. That was the point, the decision pointed. Could you tell me your opinion about that particular point, decision?
Well, I think from any reasonably objective point of view, that was the most obvious part of the Shimoda case, because the laws that had been established over several centuries prohibited indiscriminate uses of force that couldn't persuasively be associated with attacking military targets. And here, these atomic attacks were so obviously indiscriminate and disproportional, unproportional, that they violated these very basic principles of what is often called customary international law. And of course, there was no agreement or formal texts, because these weapons had never before been developed and used. But the framework of the law of war clearly prohibited this kind of massive, indiscriminate, and disproportional attack. It also prohibited the use of weapons that caused poison gas, and again, radioactivity was a new phenomenon, and whether you considered it a extension of poison gas or something that required its own legal assessment is a question that one could discuss.
So again, so you think it's really important and admirable that they clearly pointed out and they clearly said this was the violation of international law?
I think to have it authoritatively stated by a Japanese court that went out of its way to make an objective argument and withheld accountability from the Japanese government, showing that its concern was confined to the evaluation of the attacks themselves and only incidentally to the importance of the doing justice for these claims, which were not substantial given the amounts that were requested, but were more symbolic. And I think the whole intention was to express these claims as matters of conscience and not to be preoccupied with whether they were satisfied or not, but the main objective of initiating the case was to obtain this legal assessment of the attacks.
So do you admire this kind of clear decision?
A clear
Do
decision.
you agree and admire the
Yes, I think it's the clearest available decision of the attacks. I mean, there's some important scholarly writing by a series of Western. I'm not familiar with the Japanese literature, but I'm sure there's extensive Japanese literature.
And also, I learned that you pay particular attention to the point that the decision stated that the fact that there was no precedent for dropping an atomic bomb in the history does not excuse its illegality. You pointed that point
Yes.
particularly. Can you elaborate that point?
Yeah, well, it follows from the sense that there was a legal framework. There wasn't a specific precedent, but the principles of law that were incorporated in the framework were sufficiently clear in relation to what the atomic bomb did to these two cities to make the determination of illegality fully convincing in relation to legal expectations, so that you didn't require a precedent. Of course, if it existed, it might have been helpful, or on the contrary, it might have been diversionary or even confusing, because it might have been a precedent created in the West that was trying to justify the attack.
So the illegality or the international law should apply even you do first time this.
Yes.
Nobody has done before, but you cannot use that as an excuse.
Exactly. You can't use it as an excuse. You can say that it would be preferable, in light of the experience in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to have a disarmament treaty, or to have some treaty declaring the use and possession of these weapons to be unlawful. You know, there is this treaty that has been brought in recent years by initiatives centered in the Global South. It's called the Treaty of Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and it's none of the non-nuclear states are parties to this treaty, and they've the Western ones, the three NATO nuclear powers, issued a formal statement saying that they think deterrence is a preferable mode of global security than would be nuclear disarmament.
Yeah, speaking of the deterrence, you just brought, because of that, what is your opinion about the nuclear deterrence theory?
The nuclear what?
Nuclear deterrence that you mentioned, the deterrence. When you have nuclear, we can have more peace. The way of thinking.
Yeah.
Nuclear deterrence theory. What do you think about that? What is your opinion about that?
I feel it's a very misguided view. and reflects the influence of the weapons special interests of the weapons producers and the labs, the whole infrastructure of nuclear weapons development, and the fact that they want to allow certain countries to have the weapon but not others. The recent attacks on Iran are illustrative of this discriminatory attitude toward the possession of nuclear weapons, where Israel is allowed to assemble an arsenal of the weaponry and not to be even a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, while Iran, under threat, is not allowed to acquire a credible deterrent capability or even the enrichment facilities that would put it in a position to act in its own defense. So you have a kind of nuclear hegemony that is dominated by the Western nuclear powers. There's every indication that China and Russia would probably join any serious disarming process. The best argument for keeping nuclear capabilities in the present world is that you're unlikely to be attacked if you have a nuclear capability. If you compare North Korea with either Iran or Ukraine, both of which gave up the capability. I mean, North Korea didn't give up the capability. Ukraine and Libya gave up their nuclear programs and weaponry and were attacked just after that. See, it sends a very, what should I say, non-functional message to the world that nuclear weaponry is not allowed to additional states, but it's very useful for countries that are under threat. And it's not a good function. And this idea of a nuclear hegemonic order is very, makes the whole non-nuclear world dependent on the restraint of the nuclear weapons states, which is an unhealthy kind of unstable situation.
So it will not lead to the world peace.
Yes. It's contrary to world peace.
Oh, okay. Next question. What do you think were the limitation and the shortcomings of the decision of Shimoda case?
Of the what?
What were the limitation and the shortcomings of the Shimoda case?
Of the
From the
the Shimoda case?
Yes. It was significant, but at the same time, I'm sure there was a limitation and some kind of shortcomings from there.
Well, of course, the authority of the court itself was limited. It didn't have enforcement capabilities, it was part of a post-war governing structure, and it, I think, properly deferred to the Japanese government's position on its authority to waive the claims in order to secure the peace. So I think internally it was limited by this constitutional circumstance of having to divide the assessment of the attack, a legal assessment of the attacks, from the right of the claimants to pursue justice by advancing these claims against the Japanese government, or to challenge the waiver of their rights against the U.S. government. As far as the other limitations, it was a decision of a lower Japanese court, and therefore it was subject to appeal, which neither side chose to pursue, meaning that the claimants were satisfied with the finding of illegality, and didn't want to risk that being compromised, and the government was satisfied with the fact that it wasn't being held responsible or put in a position of choosing between the peace treaty and the judgment. Internationally, the bias of the international media kept the decision from being treated as important as it should have been. So it really was met with silence as something at most of importance internally in Japan, and therefore didn't have a significant influence. I at least tried to give it some influence within the international law community, and I think it has had some influence in that context.
How come the media, US media, European media, or world media, didn't report that as much as it is important, so they should have been reported?
I suspect that it was partly a failure of the claimants to try to generate interest in the case outside of Japan. See, I think they could have publicized the decision in a much more effective way in the West and in the US in particular, but in the 9 nuclear states. And I think that would have had an impact. The second thing is that the media, the influential international media, is very subject to influence from what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex, and didn't want to give credibility to this kind of legal challenge. I think those are the kind of two most prominent explanations.
So the second reason is that international media, because they were funded by so-called industrial military industry. That's why they intentionally ignore this important decision.
Yeah, well, and they basically accepted the Cold War consensus that these weapons were necessary, and they didn't want to cast doubt. It was the Western influential media like BBC, New York Times, so on. They engage in what's best known as self-censorship, to not give attention to things that would be challenges to existing fundamental core policies.
And the first reason that you mentioned, it was Japanese side, they should have been more outspoken to internationally about this result. You are saying Japan did not enough the speech, enough information, they didn't tell enough to the world.
Yeah, they treated the whole drama of the Shimoda case as something fundamentally internal to Japan, and they didn't see its potentiality as a international challenge to the nuclear establishment and to the whole idea of relying on this kind of extermination, weapon of extermination for security.
That's sad and shame. They didn't know the importance of this and the impact of this to the world.
Yeah.
Wow.
And it may reflect, I'm not enough of a student of Japanese culture, but it may reflect also a kind of Japanese insularity as far as reaching out beyond its borders. And an issue of this kind.
But also you mentioned about the Tokyo trial. It was the trial after the World War II, right? Tokyo trial done by Victor. The US actually they put the trial for the Japanese war criminal, right? So that kind of somehow mind control after the war, you still occupy Japanese mentality.
Yes.
And at this time, 1963, the Japanese government, Japanese society, Japanese even the court, they have the effect after the World War II. Even the constitution was brought by American occupation army, right?
Yes.
Do you think that kind of mentality still the effect there?
Yeah, I mean, it reinforced, I think, a cultural disposition of some insularity, and it expressed, I think, for some Japanese that I knew, a sense of Japan's own guilt and not trying to project an international image that it was a victim rather than a perpetrator. So there was sensitivity that if it complained too much about the atomic bombs, its own imperial policies would be put under a microscope again.
That's just a shame. That's so sad.
Yeah.
What about the first part you mentioned, second part you mentioned about the international media? They self-censored. At the same time, they knew the money is coming from the military industrial field. But also, how about government, U.S. government, or the government of the Western world, they had some pressure that's not to see this important court trial from Japan.
Well, see, I think it's more than money. It was the influence in the bureaucracy, because many of the bureaucrats, when they retired, they'd work for the defense, private sector defense establishment, and the nuclear weapons laboratories at Los Alamos and Livermore and Berkeley created pressure on government that very few people in Congress or in the White House felt was balanced by any important anti-nuclear pressure. See, when you have in this kind of system all the pressure coming from one side, the effective pressure, it's also true in this Israel-Palestine current context, all the funded pressure on Congress and on the government comes from the Zionist side, and there's nothing that balances that. So political figures have no incentive to take seriously Palestinian grievances. And similarly in this context, to take seriously anti-nuclear or disarmament perspectives.
And also, like we discussed, it's a really important American narrative that bomb was brought the victory, and that bomb saved so many lives. And because of that bomb, US became really superpower after the World War II. So if you deny this bomb, it was a really big deal for the US part of the story, right?
Yes, yeah, and you know they tried to show an exhibit of the damage done by the bomb at the Smithsonian Institute, and it was canceled, and the director, I think, was dismissed because it was seen as weakening the both the justifications for the way World War II ended and the idea that World War II was a just war, and also that it was seen as affecting the status of these weapons in the contemporary world.
So to report this Shimada case trial is not only about this particular weapon, but it's more like a bigger...
Yes, the context is makes it difficult to address the legality and morality of these historic events and of the current uses of the weaponry.
But from your point of view, or from the lawyer's point of view, that was totally nonsense. You should clearly see this as objectively, as a moral point of view, right? And decide it's illegal or illegal.
Yeah, yes, at least the way I understood it, but then there are other international law people that said you have to look at it in the context, the political context of the world situation, and the West is conserving the values of freedom and democracy, and it is entitled to use this weaponry in order to further that more desirable way of governing society.
So, but that was a totally strong justification about atomic bomb or nuclear weapon. Because of this, the world we are living now, we are enjoying this prosperity and peaceful for the Western world. That's why we should justify how we started this. That is atomic bomb, right?
Yeah.
So doesn't make. But by the way, so that you knew about this, you get to know about the Shimoda case trial because of your student, and also you noticed American media didn't tell this to the world at all.
Yeah.
That was somehow reason you decided to write about this Shimoda case.
Yes. I mean, those were the two most immediate factors, and that no one else would have written if I hadn't. I mean, as far as I knew.
So you thought, I have to write this.
Yes. And the American Journal of International Law, where it was published, is a fairly conservative journal, and I didn't anticipate that they would accept the article. So it got as good a professional acceptance and reputation as was possible at that time.
So they accepted.
Yes.
What kind of reaction, feedback did you get from the other lawyers?
Except from very hawkish or conservative people, a positive response. And because I was essentially reporting on what this court had done, it was my own views were not so significant in that kind of analysis.
But the fact you are the one brought this to the international world, that can tell your own stance.
Yes, it was something I was proud of doing it, and felt it was very worthwhile to do that. I didn't know what the reactions would be, but even if they'd been highly adverse, I was prepared to accept that. Because I thought it was important to show the relevance of the Shimoda case to the current reliance on these weapons.
This is somehow the counter thought about that time the atmosphere in the society or international society.
Yes. Yeah, I should say the atmosphere was also affected by the Cuban Missile Crisis that came just before before the decision in '62, and that made many people aware of the insecurity of this post-World War II global order, and even the leaders of the Soviet Union and the U.S. subsequently collaborated to a greater extent, but the focus was shifted from getting rid of the weapons to controlling them, from disarmament to arms control. which is a concession to what I call nuclearism, and because it stabilizes reliance on the weapons. And it's more spelled out, my own views are more spelled out in this collaborative book with Robert Lifton on what we hoped would also add weight to the anti-nuclear arguments.
So you had some lawyer saying, admiring you to let this important trial no to the war, but also did you get some kind of the opposition? They're saying, how come you put this somebody against you about this your article?
Not in any formal way, but there was certain criticism, including my sort of mentor as a law student at Yale Law School, who was also writing on these issues, but was much closer to the official U.S. outlook, and took the position that the U.S. is defending the free world and needs to do whatever it thinks effective in order to uphold that responsibility.
And like you mentioned about the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Cuban crisis, Cuba, this kind of thing, think about this. Actually, this issue is again really political,
Yes.
affected by the situation they are in. I think, wow, okay.
But see, it was very fortunate in retrospect that Kennedy and Khrushchev were the heads of the two governments, because at least in the American case, we know that all the military leadership and the political members of the highest levels of government all were prepared and favored a nuclear confrontation.
Favored?
Yeah, they favored a nuclear confrontation. They thought of it as an opportunity both to defend the Western Hemisphere and a way of defeating the Soviet Union.
So again, if you think that way, you don't want to listen, you want to read your book, your article, or you don't want to know about Shimoda trial.
Yes, yes. I mean, it's very much counter to the prevailing ideas about prevailing ideas in the West about upholding security, and privately, this wouldn't be said very much publicly, but privately also pursuing strategic objectives throughout the world. So it has a geopolitical edge as well as a security argument.
Oh, okay, yeah, wow, it's really, yeah, okay. but by the way, among the 5 plaintiffs, we had the 5 plaintiffs in the similar case. 5.
Five claimants.
Yeah. Then who impressed you the most?
Well, I really didn't have knowledge or access to their individual stories. And I imagine this play was much more graphic about that. I don't know.
Okay. By the way, what do you think about the lawyer, Mr. Nishida, who first filed the lawsuit?
I think it was a brilliant tactical move by those that wanted to see the world freed from this terrible tragedy that affected the people of Japan.
And again, thinking about where world were at that time, the atmosphere, and about Cuban Missile Crisis, everything, like we discussed, this the lawyer Nishida brought the 45 lawsuit, really important timing.
Yes, and if I had the power, I would have awarded him the Nobel Peace Prize.
Really?
Yeah, because I think it was a courageous and, as you say, timely and maybe indispensable effort to avoid this or to weaken this consensus that security required, the security of the state required such weaponry.
Do you think many people in the international lawyers, the field, do they agree you? Do they think to see this lawyer?
Well, I think they would think it was unrealistic and maybe that it's more helpful to emphasize arms control rather than disarmament. And there's a tendency in elite circles, leadership circles, to talk about disarmament and opposition to nuclear weapons as a useful fiction because it sort of comforts public opinion, but it doesn't act in a politically serious way. And I've heard that kind of effort made, and of course it's very cynical because it pretends to be against nuclear weaponry, but in fact it supports it.
So from that point of view, also this is not this is a real thing. So that's why this kind of decision is very important.
Yes, I think so, and even now retains an importance.
Okay, now you have repeatedly mentioned that Shimoda case was victory. Do you remember what you kind of repeatedly put the phrase? The Shimoda case was the victory of law and morality.
Yeah.
You mentioned. Can you mention that? So how do you see the Shimoda case? How do you mention?
Well, I think as a victory of law, it acknowledged the relevance of these fundamental principles about the prohibition on indiscriminate weaponry and a disproportionate attack that can't be justified by military necessity and causes severe human suffering. And so that on that basis, I think it was legally a very important step. As far as politically, it was going against the prevailing current of opinion, and it was like a voice in the wilderness, so to speak, and in that sense, prophetic voices have always had to deal with the fact that the current environment was not receptive to their message. And I think that was true here.
I think, Rand, you mentioned that it was the victory of law and morality. You mentioned that, right? As a result of the voices of students and the consensus of judiciary came together.
Yes.
That I think you have repeatedly mentioned this phrase, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. So, can you repeat that? I want to ask you, how do you evaluate and put Shimoda case in the context of this, the law and morality?
Well, see, good lawyers can always find an argument for the position they want to take, and there's no assurance that law will serve the human interest or justice. It can be used for colonial purposes. It can be used by autocrats to keep the public citizenry helpless to challenge state policy. So it is important in my approach to law that it be connected with the pursuit of justice and therefore embody universal moral values as embedded in the UN Charter and as found in the whole development of human rights, including the right to life, the right to peace. And so it's a justice-driven conception of law. And the idea that law is above politics and morality is, in my view, misleading and regressive. Because it's misleading because, as I say, you can find a legal argument for almost any position. You see it now with genocide in Gaza that Israel and its supporters describe as self-defense. So that's one difficulty. And the other difficulty is that for law to be a positive influence, it has to incorporate these fundamental moral principles. And to the extent they're excluded, it casts law in a very negative moral role.
Okay. And so from that point of view, let us change the battery.
Oh.
So you mentioned it's really important how the justice should be. But so from that point of view, you mentioned Shimoda case was the victory. Can you mention victory of what? And as a result of what? Why do you think Shimoda case was?
Well, because I think it viewed law from a justice-driven perspective and didn't try to interpret law from a power-oriented perspective. And those are the two principal ways in which law is understood and applied in human affairs.
This is how you say normally you mentioned the Shimoda number 9.
Yes.
Shimoda case of victory number 9.
Well, that I only mean there that the fact that these claimants probably deliberately or coincidentally expressed the conscience of society by initiating this case, and that correlated with the response by the court taking an enlightened view of the legal issues at stake.
That's why how you say Shimoda case was the victory?
Yes, I mean maybe victory is not the best word to use, but it was a
how do you can you start with the word Shimoda case was? How do you?
Well, it was a contribution to what a humane interpretation of this weaponry of mass destruction in the post-1945 world by reinterpreting what happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
What about in the context or in the text with the word law and morality?
Yeah, well, that's what I was trying to explain, that law without morality tends to reflect the will of the powerful, either the rich or either the forces of wealth or of political power. And that was absent here, and therefore what was reflected was the fusion of the conscience of society with the justice-driven interpretation of the law.
So instead of like the leaders or king or society of top people, but more of the voice of citizens. It was the result of the voice of citizen.
Yes.
Was represented by that.
Yeah, it was reinforced and validated.
Okay. But by the way, we discussed but what impact has the Shimoda case had on international society and ICJ's advisory opinion?
It's very difficult to say because there's very little explicit reference to it. Whether it influenced the general atmosphere of interpretation, I'm not clear about. As I say, I think it had the potential to be a more significant influence than it was because of this failure to carry the message beyond the shores of Japan.
But you mentioned that it was the base, the starting point of the international law decision and how to see this weaponry. It was really impactful, the influential decision, right?
I didn't understand.
The Shimoda case decision was almost the base, the first step.
Yes.
For the international society and ICJs, how we see this weapon, nuclear weapon. So it was effective, influential for the ICJ's advisory opinion.
I don't know that. I did have some contact with the judges that were involved with the advisory opinion, and I can't recall whether they were familiar with the Shimoda case or not, but I think it at least made people feel that it was respectable for judges and lawyers to adopt a critical view of this weaponry.
It was a big deal, again, thinking about the world where we were at that time and the international society. It was a really big deal, even like the feeling of.
Yes, and in that sense, both the advisory opinion and the Shimoda case were attempts to create resistance to this momentum that had built up around the development of nuclear weapons.
So the point is, even though, like I said, because of the limitation of media or lack of media coverage, not actually the JCB's advisory opinion, the judges or lawyers may not have known well in the detail of Shimoda case, but still the fact it was happened in Japan and they noticed about a little bit about that is really encouraging the incident.
Yes.
So that means it was somehow really impactful and influential.
Yes, and there was a much wider feeling of the injustice of the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. My co-author in this book had done a lot of work in Japan with the survivors of the attacks. He's more of a psychohistorian, but not a lawyer. But
okay. By the way, 1996, 14 judges in ICJ deliberated whether the use of nuclear weapon is illegal in international law.
yes.
As a result, as you know, judges were divided between those who see it illegal in international law and those who permit them in case for only defense purpose, right? What is your opinion about that?
Well, as I haven't recently looked at the text of the advisory opinion, but my primary recollection is that the majority of judges concluded that a possible legal justification existed if the survival of the state was put at risk. In other words, as an ultimate security, but that even that, they said, was only a possible legal justification, not they didn't endorse that as a legal justification. So, and the dissenting judges basically concluded that the opinion was not strong enough and it should have gone further in prohibiting nuclear weapons.
So, what is your opinion about this? There is majority of judges said there could be a possibility if it risking the country's survival, right? But what do you think about that? Or like the fact that the judges are divided?
It's a on one side a difficult question, and it's hard to answer it without a specific context where those events, that choice is being posed. But overall, I would say that if one favors an unconditional prohibition on the use and possession of these weapons, then that's an unacceptable possible exception.
Like you mentioned before, the law, that some people mentioned to you that if you think about the law, we have to think about the political, the consequence, context. But this doesn't. It was totally. It is against what you said right now. If they are talking about the one country is risking the survival, then something illegal become all of a sudden legal. That doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, it's saying that it's illegal except possibly. See, they don't altogether say it's legal, and generally, the right to self-defense is illegal. I mean, it's illegal to use force except if you're attacked. See, there's a certain kind of structure of these legal prohibitions that allows exceptions to be made.
So, do you accept this 14 judges divided and both sides had their own opinion?
Yes, as I say, though, the majority, I mean, all of the judges, I think, agreed that the only possible legal justification was this survival argument, and they all confirmed the applicability of Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which pledged the nuclear states to pursue nuclear disarmament in good faith. And that Article 6 has been completely ignored, while the obligation to get rid of the weapons or not pursue the weapons has been rigidly, although selectively, enforced.
So you are saying that this judges, this was the reality, and this is how much we can go for the international law stage about nuclear weapon, because it does make sense to me, because the country can say we are risking the survival, we are losing, that's why we need to use this. That is so.
Yeah, it's a dangerous exception, and I certainly wouldn't favor it. Of course, compared with the fact that it's unregulated now, the use is not kept secret, the war plans for nuclear weapons. This was an attempt to narrow the role that they could play. It was far from a perfect prohibition or an unconditional prohibition, but it was certainly better than the entirely discretionary approach to the use of this weaponry, including potentially preemptive uses where you anticipate a threat and act to forestall it.
So this is the reality, and this is how much we have progressed.
No, the reality is the unregulated nature and secret. You don't even know what the reality is.
Okay. By the way, looking at the current global situation, including the war in Ukraine, the nuclear threat is clearly greater than ever before. Can you give me your thought about it?
Yes, I haven't written very much about it, but certainly I agree that the voicing of these threats by Putin in Moscow and by the way in which Biden in particular responded did lead the UN Secretary General to say we're just one miscalculation away from nuclear catastrophe. And people have said that the so-called doomsday clock of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists should be moved even closer to midnight. So it's definitely a dangerous moment, second only probably to the Cuban Missile Crisis.
And I learned that about this kind of issue, you mentioned that you have been strongly alarming the world by saying in the Russia and Ukraine war, the more Putin is cornered, the more he is tempted to reach for nuclear weapon. And this is what you are saying, strongly alarming. On the other hand, the West is also leaning towards military than diplomatic. The world is heading towards geopolitical madness.
Political what?
Madness.
Mutiny?
Madness. Mad. The crazy.
Oh.
Yeah. This is something you strongly alarming the world.
Yes.
Can you please elaborate this about?
Well, as my underlying analysis suggests, any kind of effort to make plausible the use of nuclear weapons or to threaten them is very dangerous, because it can lead to an interaction where each side calculates that unless it increases the threat, it will be seen as weak. and past wars have often come from that kind of failed communication. World War I was often seen as stumbling into a war that no one wanted. But now the stakes are very high if countries with nuclear weapons stumble into a war in which the weapons become the alternative to political defeat. And that seems quite possible in the context of the Ukraine war. It's difficult to judge whether that risk has decreased with the Trump presidency, because he's so inconsistent in what he says about Ukraine.
But anyway, so I want to ask you about this particular important, your own alarming to the world. In case of Russia and Ukraine war, how do you see the Putin? You mentioned that the Putin is cornered. We are having the difficulty, right? So can you mention about Putin?
Yeah, I think he's a autocratic leader who is committed to Russian nationalism and expansionism, but is rational and informed, and is less likely to make a miscalculation than are the Western leaders that tend to be at this stage more emotional and more eager to reassert Western dominance after the Cold War.
And if we evaluate the situation in Ukraine and Russia, you mentioned that the more Putin is cornered, you remember you mentioned.
Yes.
Can you tell me about that word? The more,
Well,
using the more.
By that I mean the more that that he and Russia are faced with the prospect of a major political defeat, the more likely he is to pursue a high-risk strategy, which could involve the use of tactical nuclear weapons. And even tactical nuclear weapons are as dangerous or more dangerous than what was used against the Japanese cities.
And how about in the meantime, how about they look at the Western world? How about the West? Are they really dealing with the diplomatic stuff? Also, you can mention about this yeah. About the West.
The West, which really means the NATO countries, seems to believe that only by forcibly deterring Russia, even in its traditional sphere of influence, which Ukraine is, can it uphold its security. And that's where the danger lies, in part, that Russia considers any attempt to draw Ukraine into a Western sphere of influence is deeply threatening to their security.
Yeah.
So out of these contradictory views of how to uphold vital national interests, a direct military encounter is not, I wouldn't call it likely or probable, but certainly more possible than we would have wished for.
So the U.S., do you think U.S. is leaning towards the diplomatic discussion or military? Can you mention that part?
I think it was opposed to diplomatic discussion during the Biden presidency. As far as the present is concerned, it seems to waver on whether to embark on diplomacy at this stage. And as far as we can tell, Putin, who has been receptive in the past, seems now not to be particularly receptive. And Trump, as a irregular kind of leader, seems to waver or shift from favoring diplomacy to favoring military confrontation. So it's a very unpredictable situation.
So not only the Russia, Putin, but also Western world, as you mentioned, not going for diplomatic discussion, but more towards military.
As I say, Europe seems to be definitely favoring a military approach, to increasing its military spending by a large amount, and it's taking a rather belligerent posture. And then you have the Zelensky government in Ukraine also taking a position that sometimes seems receptive to diplomacy, but at other times seems to reject it. So it's a very complicated, dangerous, uncertain situation.
You mentioned this is geopolitical. What do you mean? Craziness or madness? What?
Well, I think the Ukraine war became what I call a geopolitical war between the U.S. and Russia, concerned with what was perceived to be a Russian challenge to U.S. dominance after the Cold War, and it was also treated as an occasion of communicating to China that if it tried to become a geopolitical rival of the U.S., it would face this kind of military response. So, in my belief, the Ukrainian people were made to fight a war that was really between these two geopolitical actors, and that their interests would have been served by some kind of diplomatic accommodation. Because there's no question that in the eastern part of Ukraine, the population favors some kind of Russian protective role.
So, but the Russians could touch the nuclear, and also West is also going more towards military. And you mentioned it was a geopolitical madness, right? Is that you mentioned that?
Which 12?
This one. 12. Geopolitical.
Oh.
You mentioned that?
Yes, well,
That geopolitical madness is a matter of this rivalry being carried forward with the dangers of military confrontation arising out of the U.S.'s effort to defend its dominance of the post-Cold War world, and China and to some extent Russia wanting a more sphere of influence kind of world order in which the geopolitical actors have exclusive control over their own regions.
So how do you call this the situation in Russia and Ukraine right now? You mentioned geopolitical what?
Mentioned.
How did you mention this, the phrase of the Russia and Russian situation in Ukraine? You mentioned geographical danger, geographical.
Yes. Well, you have. It's important to remember that World War III was avoided during the Cold War by respecting spheres of influence and geopolitical fault lines. The Biden administration particularly tried to redefine the global order as doing away with spheres of influence and geopolitical fault lines, and spoke about a rule-governed world. And that was completely misleading and antagonistic to the goals of China and Russia. So it set up a situation that has the likelihood of stimulating a new Cold War.
And how do you call this situation? Geopolitical what?
Madness? You mean, yes, because it's at the time when the world is challenged by these universal problems like climate change and migration, poverty, all kinds of global issues, to engage in this geopolitical rivalry is to encourage self-destructive outcomes.
So can you repeat again what you mentioned?
What?
Or how you call it?
Well,
if you can mention the particular phrase, geographical.
Well, I have used the perhaps inflammatory terminology of geopolitical madness because it is undervaluing cooperative problem solving on a global level and encouraging a kind of suicidal military encounter that not only is highly costly, very expensive, but also imperils the future in a very dangerous way.
Okay, thank you. And five more quickly. いいですかね。Japanese government uphold the three, as you know, Japanese government uphold the three non-nuclear principles in Japan, right? Don't have it, don't make it, don't let it in. That, you know that, right? In Japan. On the other hand, the reality, Japan has relied upon American nuclear umbrella, right? And takes a stand that without cooperation with the US, nuclear abolition is not realistic. That's what they say, right? So this is totally contradictory. It's 2 points. I know this is relative, but what kind of opinion do you have about that situation?
Well, I think that contradiction reflects both the sentiments of the Japanese people that really want to be detached from engagement with nuclear weaponry in either in any kind of alliance situation or their own security planning, which is on one side. That's the post Hiroshima and Nagasaki nuclear inhibition, but on the other side is the political realism that is shared with the Western governments, and particularly with the US, that conceives of security in terms of protection and regards protection in the nuclear age as requiring the willingness to be guarded against attacks from others by the threat of nuclear retaliation. So it can keep its anti-nuclear domestic politics while pursuing a nuclearist foreign policy view of security.
But do you agree and accept it?
Well, no, I don't agree. I think it weakens the Japanese moral position on the weaponry because it seems to be making a kind of bargain between what it tells the world its attitude is and what it really is doing in terms of practical security arrangements. I think given the influence of political realism on major governments, it's not surprising that Japan falls in line, so to speak, with this pragmatic attitude toward nuclear weaponry and feels safer under the nuclear umbrella. So it shares the tutelage of the countries that defeated it in World War II and has incorporated that in its own political consciousness.
Yeah, pragmatic is kind of good word, but actually it is double standard, totally, right? And Japan is a country, like you say, similar case. We had a similar case. So we brought the basic of the illegality of international law about nuclear weapon. On the other hand, we are totally relying upon nuclear weapon. It's totally double standard, right? So it is lie, big lie.
Yeah. It's if you look at it as in a single coherent way, it's certainly a lie. I mean, as I say, you can create a rationale based on what you wish for and what you plan for. See, and that playing it safe in the nuclear age, you're better off with a nuclear umbrella than you are by going it alone without the means to protect yourself.
Come on, you told me you were the international lawyer and based upon the moral, but then all of a sudden you became really nice to Japan.
No.
Because maybe I'm from Japan, because your mother from Japan.
Well, it's not my preference, but it's in trying to understand how this has happened, how this apparent contradiction has materialized. It's important to take account of different influences that the Japanese political leadership has felt. And also, of course, it was a partially occupied country after World War II, and therefore was subject to this kind of U.S. Both dominance and influence, and seemed to prefer to the reliance on the U.S. political realism than to expose itself to hostile forces, potentially hostile forces. But it's only, I'm not endorsing the view, I'm just trying to understand it.
But again, you admire the Shimoda case and also the lawyer Nishida to brought up this, right? Even from Japan. I'm talking about the Shimoda case at that time, right? Then Japan is now acting like this, like a chicken. So what's going on there? Do you feel like it's kind of sad?
Well, I see that as something that is as I've been saying, a desirable way of reinterpreting from a legal moral perspective the experience of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but not explicitly addressing what Japan should be doing in the present world situation.
Sure. I'm sorry. I totally understand that. Yeah, it's my own translation. What message do you think the Shimoda case have for us now?
Well, I think the important message is to remember the past, that this can happen. It's not just a theoretical discussion. Japan experienced the trauma of this kind of weaponry, which of course is much more destructive now than it was then, and that the world seems to not be listening to that lesson. It hasn't learned the lessons. And that the Shimoda case is important because it's an attempt to teach the world, or at least to interpret Japanese experience in a way that has a lesson for the future and a lesson for humanity. And the sooner we learn that lesson, the more likely we are to survive.
So it was a really big important.
Yes.
Yeah, so okay. Just again, just recently, we discussed last week, U.S. attacked nuclear facility in Iran. And tensions are building again, really. And the military conflict could escalate. That is a worry. And again, the ordinary people continue to be caught up in the war. The leaders are okay, but ordinary people, right? Again, what do you think about this reality that innocent, ordinary people continue to be caught up in the war?
Well, I think as long as the world is organized around these states that have the loyalty of their citizens, particularly in war-peace situations, the governments of these states have, together with the media, have the capability of brainwashing people to accept intolerable risks and to engage in this very self-destructive behavior. But so that we're living in a very stage where the species, human species as a whole, is in great danger from this kind of governance. And what can resist this is quite unclear. There's no political path that will liberate the world from the nuclear threat.
That's kind of really pessimistic way of seeing the world.
Yes, it's a pessimistic way, and I would condition that by saying we don't know the future. It often surprises us. The collapse of the Soviet Union was completely unexpected when it occurred. So good things could happen as well as terrible things, even though the trends definitely are discouraging, and part of the problem is that the leadership of governments take a very short-term outlook on their roles, and these problems are longer term and require a different sort of perspective, I think.
Okay, last question. You mentioned that the Shimoda case was a really important and inspiring trial and decision to the world, right? Not to, even though it's in Japan, but also it was really inspiring to the world. And thinking about the Japanese reality, that we are totally relying upon umbrella, U.S. umbrella, and also we have this strong activity about anti-nuclear. So do you think Japan, we talked about the double standard, and but that is the reality. Looking back, the good example of Shimoda case, do you think Japan should more positive, strong role to play in the field of anti-nuclear? Because I think Japan has a right to do that, because we are the only country, and also Japan has, I think, obligation and duty, responsibility to the world. What do you think about that?
Yes, I think that's a very compelling political and moral argument. Whether it can penetrate the power structure of Japan, which is weighted toward alliance with the U.S. and toward giving conservative elites a lot of influence on decision making, and I don't know what the economic implications are, but it seems to me that Japan, if it did go in the direction of your question, would exert a very powerful moral influence on the world that could make a historic difference. And one hopes that somehow that will happen. It would require a very committed movement in Japan that would generate the kind of leadership and atmosphere that would throw away the nuclear umbrella and stand before the world as an advocate of denuclearization and abolition of nuclear weapons.
Do you think Japan can do that?
Who knows?
Mm-hmm. Do you agree if Japan does that? Do you admire it?
With that scenario? Yes, I think it would. I think.
So that what kind of scenario are you talking about? Concretely, yeah.
To generate that?
No. What kind of attitude are you admiring and may agree for the future of Japan?
Well, I think that the only viable attitude for Japan coming to grips with its past and projecting it into the future is to clarify its identity around an anti-nuclear agenda. But what social forces could enable that development is something that I'm not able to identify or articulate.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yeah, I know
you covered lots of ground.
Huh?
You covered lots of ground.
Yeah, but because this is a really big issue, right? Hi. This time, No interview now.
Okay.
No talk, yeah.
So when shall I do it? Now?
Yeah, I'll let you know. 한국
Oh.
もういいですよ。
もういいよ。
うん
こっち見ていい大丈夫ね。
こっち見なければ。
OK, come. Go. Camera. You can put the. Do you put the slide on? Normally? Yeah.
Yes, I think so.
回りました。
Hi.
Welcome.
Nice to meet you. It's a beautiful house.
Good to see you.
Can I come in?
Please.